I'm a big fan of newspapers. I know they're obsolete and outdated, that most people get their news from the radio or even television nowadays, but I quite like the feel of a newspaper in my hands. I guess I'm old fashioned that way. A lot of people would say that, and I guess it would be pretty accurate. But I think something a lot of people discount is the privacy of having a big piece of paper in front of your face that newspapers can afford you. You don't even have to be reading it. Just hold it up and it's like you disappear in plain sight. No need to do anything silly either, like cutting a hole in it to look out of. That just makes you look ridiculous, and usually just listening to conversation is enough. And of course, you can read the news from it, which was the whole point of the thing in the first place. A truly undervalued piece of medium in this modern age. I had my face in one even now, as I sat at a small diner and enjoyed a cup of coffee. One sugar, one cream. Nothing wrong with a little sweetness in your life, that's what I always say, and that should carry over into your food as well. The headline of the oh so often forgotten paper was screaming about some politician I didn't give a rat's ass about, so I skipped over it and went deeper, looking at some of the smaller articles. The pork ban was still in effect, which did sour my mood a little. The paper said it was an illness similar to mad cow disease, but for, of course, pigs. Maybe it was even true. I had seen one of them once, wandering the streets, just right there in the middle of town. Somehow, it had escaped from a slaughterhouse or something similar, wherever pigs are kept. That wasn't important. What was important was the animal itself. It had looked awful, stumbling and frothing at the mouth. It moved like it had no sense of self-preservation at all, walking directly into the path of traffic and right up to people, who shrank away from it immediately. As I stared at it, with its strange, clammy skin and white foam dribbling from its mouth, an animal control van rounded the corner, going much too fast for what seemed strictly necessary. Perhaps they were worried about rabies, which didn't seem out of the question for this poor thing. But as they captured it, using long poles and nets, I got a good look at it before it was taken away. As wild as it may seem, I could have sworn that from the center of its forehead grew a giant third eye, right there, yellow and rolling. Then it was gone, but I knew what I saw. So while I love my newspapers, I know that you can't always trust what you read, what you hear, what you see from the media. But just because you can't always believe it, doesn't mean you can't learn from it. So I shook off these memories, so different from this quiet midnight diner, and went back to reading my paper. I took a small sip of my coffee as a piece about world news grabbed my eye, and I began to read it. According to it, the number of disappearances all over the world had been skyrocketing recently, leaving experts baffled. This was funny, in a macabre sort of way. You see, I knew of a disappearance myself, so in a way, I had made the news. It was a mother, seemingly vanished off the face of the earth, and I had been hired to find her. The waitress approached from the other side of the counter, holding a pot of coffee. "Refill, sir?" She smiled, that sort of bland, tired smile that all service workers seem to have. She was a nice woman, pretty, but much too young for me. Besides, no one liked to be bothered while on the job with that sort of thing, especially in the middle of the night, especially by middle-aged men, who for whatever reason couldn't seem to let go of the old styles of media. "No, thank you," I said, and she nodded before going back to standing behind the register and got busy looking bored. The entire establishment only had a scant few patrons, including myself, so there wasn't much for her to do. It was dark out, and this was one of the few places still open this late into the night. But even with that fact, there were very few people in this place. I took a discreet look around, getting a feel for the other individuals who found themselves here at this odd time. There was the waitress, of course, a single cook in the kitchen, myself, an elderly man sitting alone in a booth, and finally a young couple, sitting at the other end of the counter, talking to one another in low tones. A very slow night indeed. A glance out the window confirmed that the street was as deserted as this place was. Good. It should make my job tonight a little bit easier. I went back to reading my paper, but my mind wasn't focused on it. I was thinking about what had led me to being out here in the first place, watching others to see if they were watching me. I had been sitting in my small, cramped office, where the light was dim and the tiny window behind me did little to break the gloom. Perhaps the fact that I had shuttered it didn't help, but I liked my privacy. I had been working on some paperwork, cursing how bad I was with numbers, when there had been a knock at the door. "It's open," I had said, barely even looking up from my work. The door creaked open, and peering through the stuffy room, I thought for a moment that perhaps it had opened on its own, as there was nobody there. But then I looked down and saw him. He was a young boy, couldn't have been older than 10, holding a piggy bank and trying to hide how nervous he clearly was. He took a deep breath, clutching the small object to his chest. It was white, with green clovers printed all over it. Perhaps he thought it would bring him some luck. The boy walked over to my desk, him and his brightly colored toy looking very out of place in my dark and dingy office. He stopped right in front of me, his face barely clearing the top of my desk. "You're a detective, right?" he asked quietly, struggling to make eye contact. "That's what it says on my door. But listen, kid, I'm not going to find your missing tricycle for you," I said, perhaps a bit gruffer than I meant to. I hated paperwork. "No, it's not that," he said quickly. It's my mom. She's been missing for a couple of days, and I was hoping you could find her for me." He uncorked his piggy bank and dumped the contents onto my desk. Various coins went rolling amongst a few crumpled $1 bills. It couldn't have been more than $10 at most. I sighed. "What did you say your name was, kid?" "Seth." "Listen, Seth, where's your dad?" He frowned at that, still struggling to look me in the eyes. "He's with the police. He said that they had the best chance of finding her, but when I lost my red scooter, they wouldn't even listen to me when I tried to tell them." I suppressed the urge to smile. I liked this kid. He had drive. Went to the second option when the first didn't work out. But still, I couldn't just take every sob story that came through my doors. I had mouths to feed. Mainly mine. But then I looked at the kid again, and I saw that despite the fact that he had been putting on a brave face, he was on the verge of tears. In this kid's eyes, I was his last hope of finding his mom. I didn't know how to tell him that she had probably run off with some other man or got tired of the domestic life or something like that. It wasn't romantic, and was in fact always disappointing to find, but I knew from experience that's what it ended up being about 90% of the time. Still, with his big misty eyes staring at me, I just couldn't bring myself to be the person who broke that hard truth to him. My old partner, she would have told me that I was being a big softy again, that this kind of thing was why I was operating out of a one-room office. But she wasn't here. So with a wary sigh, I reached across the desk and took the meager payment. The kid lit up as I did so, and I couldn't help but give him a small smile, before quickly hiding it behind a scowl. No need to let this whole thing get out of hand. I still had somewhat of a reputation to uphold. "All right, tell me what you know." What he knew, it turned out, was not very much. He knew his mom worked for a company called Looking Forward, which was, as far as I could gather, a charity organization for abused women. Very noble. He couldn't tell me what she actually did, though, just that it had something to do with numbers. I guess that's what I get for trying to get information from a probably 8-year-old. I wanted to talk to his father about it, get some more information than what meager amount Seth was able to give me. But the kid insisted I didn't bother him, to the point that when I argued with him about it, I was worried he was going to have a nervous breakdown right there and then. Finally, when I simply asked why, he just got real nervous looking and insisted that his father was a very busy man and that he wouldn't want to be bothered by something like this. This was clearly bullshit, and I considered asking about it further. But even just that simple question was clearly a no-go, so I let it go for now. Besides, I've taken cases with less to work with anyway, and I was never one to shy away from a challenge. But that did mean I was mostly flying blind. I was able to gather that his mother's name was Ruth Levy, which Seth told me, and she worked for accounting at the charity. I had the yellow pages to thank for that information, which is where you should always start when you're trying to find anything about anyone. It really was as easy as looking up, looking forward in them. But then again, it wasn't like anyone was trying to hide them from me. This was public information. Even better, when following the trail, another name grabbed my eye. A woman who also worked accounting. Same last name, same company. One would have to assume they were relatives. And that seemed like the most logical place to follow next. So I called her, on a payphone, of course. "Excuse me, is this Hannah?" I asked. "Yeah, what do you want?" The voice on the other end was rough but feminine, and the tone made it clear that she was not interested in being sold anything. "I'm calling about Ruth Levy. I understand you two are related. No need to make it complicated." "What? Is something wrong with her?" "I haven't seen her in a couple days, sure, but that's my sister for you, always going AWOL at the most random of times." My eyes widened in shock, but I made sure not to make any noise. She didn't know that Ruth had gone missing. That meant that not only did Seth not tell her, the police didn't ask her any questions either. Following that meant that most likely the only people that knew about her disappearance were me, Seth, and his father, as they definitely would have asked a close relative about her. Thus, the only conclusion I could draw was that Seth had lied to me about his dad working with the police. But why? Why would he lie to me about that? What was he keeping from me? I had only just started this case, and I was already finding holes, things that weren't making sense. "Hello?" Hannah's voice on the other end sounded impatient, but in fairness, I had been standing there in silence for at least 30 seconds, processing all of this. The silence was becoming noticeable, but I was unsure of what to tell her. I had to make up my mind quickly. No, nothing is wrong. I'm just calling from work. She was supposed to help me with some papers." I lied quickly. On the other end of the line, a dismissive noise. "Yeah, sorry about that. You might want to just go and do the work yourself." Her voice lowered just a bit. "I really do wish you would stop doing stuff like this. It worries me every time." Another pause, this time from her, before she seemed to suddenly remember that she was talking to a stranger. "Oh, never mind. Didn't mean to get all personal with you." "It's all right. Thank you. Have a good night," I said. "You too," she responded, then hung up, leaving me alone in silence, with nothing but the sounds of the wind blowing outside the glass phone booth. A short conversation, but very enlightening indeed. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. I headed home, intent on getting some rest. Then, me and Seth were going to have a little talk. The next day, I went to the address of one Ruth Levy, where I had a feeling I would find a certain young boy. The home was a modest, one-story affair, but with a well-kept front yard that had a few small children's toys scattered around. There was no car in the driveway. I knocked on the well-worn wooden door and heard a scuffling noise coming from inside. A moment later, the door cracked open, and I saw a small face peering out at me through it. "You lied to me," I said simply. Child or not, I didn't appreciate being led on like that. For a moment, there was nothing, and I had a feeling that he was seriously considering closing the door on me and just hoping that I went away. But then he pushed it open, revealing a messy hallway and a little boy wearing a shirt with a movie monster on it and an old pair of jeans. He stared down at the ground, refusing to look at my face. Instead, he gestured for me to come inside, which I did. He closed the door behind me, and I glanced around, taking in the house. It was well lived in, to say the least. The hallway was honestly the worst part, with most of the mess being concentrated in it, in the form of various coats and jackets being scattered around. The connecting living room and small kitchen, in comparison, were fairly tidy. Light streamed through several large windows in said rooms, giving the whole place a warm feeling. Satisfied, I looked back at the boy, who still hadn't looked up at me once. "I'm sorry," he muttered to the floor, almost inaudibly. I raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you just tell me your dad didn't contact the police? Why does it seem like no one else knows about your mother? Why are you home right now when you should be in school? What are you keeping from me?" I wasn't yelling, exactly, but my voice had gotten much harsher. His voice, on the other hand, trembled as he gave his answer. He was trying very hard to hold back tears. I didn't want them to take me away," he sniffled. Another moment of silence. In the distance, I heard a dog barking. I sighed and gestured for him to come with me. He followed in silence, tears streaming down his face, as we went and sat at the worn kitchen table, sunlight covering us both in its golden rays from the window. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. "Where's your dad, kid?" I said, my voice just a little bit softer. His fingers traced the grooves in the old wood of the table as he looked at it. "I don't know. I never knew him. It's just been me and Mom forever." He sounded a little better, now that my tone was calmer, but he was still threatening to burst into tears at any moment. "Sometimes Auntie would look after me when Mom had to go away, but it's pretty much just been me and her." "Kid," I started, and it was pretty obvious what I was thinking. "Please," he whispered pleadingly, looking up at me for the first time. "Please, just find my mom. Don't make me go to an orphanage. I know she's still out there. She's gone away like this before, but she always comes back. But it's been days this time, and she didn't say anything, and..." His voice broke here, and he didn't say anything else. Another long moment of silence. I looked around, at the dishes piling up in the sink, the dirty clothes, the child in front of me that should be in school. "Does your aunt live near here?" I finally asked. He looked at me with surprise. Yeah, not too far away. Just a couple of streets," he said. "And why didn't you go to her earlier?" I asked. Well, normally Mom drops me off there, and I don't know, it seemed like I would be bothering her, and yeah." He looked at me lamely. All I could do was shake my head. Children. I never really understood them. His mother was missing, and he didn't want to bother his aunt about it. "Go. Stay with her." He looked at me, and I knew what he was going to say. He was going to beg me not to tell her, because he was scared that he would be sent away. I have no clue where he got this idea from. Most likely he would go to live with his aunt if he really was parentless, and I told him this. He seemed surprised, and after a bit more talking, he agreed to go over there and tell her that his mom had gone missing again, and that he needed to stay with her. He agreed. I told him I would go over and check out her work tonight, but that he had to tell his aunt everything. He agreed again, and that was that. I gave the house a look through with the boy's permission, seeing if there was anything I could find that may be conducive to the case, but found only standard living affair, nothing that may hint on where his mother went. So then it was time for me to go, and there I was, standing at the threshold of the house, looking back at the kitchen, at that little boy that was sitting alone at a table as he got ready to go to his aunt's. And I felt like I needed to say something. It felt wrong to just leave him there like that. "I'll find her," I promised. I normally don't make promises like that. They were too easy to break, but I had to say something. Anything. He looked at me, with just a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, almost too quiet to hear. And then I was gone, out the door and down the street, leaving him alone in that empty house. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. I still don't. Maybe I should have just gotten the police involved instead. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was pride, because I wanted to be the one to solve the case. Maybe I just had a bad feeling about it. I don't know. But I did it, and that is how I ended up here, sitting at a late-night diner, drinking my coffee and biding my time, looking at the other customers to make sure they weren't looking at me. Finally, when the clock on the wall read 11, I stood up, folding my newspaper and tucking it under my arm. I left payment for the drink, cash, with a small tip. And then I was gone, out the door and into the cold night. There was one other place I wanted to check, the place that was perhaps as important to Ruth as her own home, her place of work. The streets were quiet, of course. Who in their right mind would be out at this hour? I didn't want to say that this was a bad part of town. It wasn't. But you can never be too careful, so why take the risk? But some things had to be done under the cover of night. And besides, I had protection. The revolver on my belt under my coat was a comforting weight, reassuring me that I wasn't defenseless. The seventh shot, I had named it. My partner, my ex-partner, had told me that was a bad name, that it only had 6 chambers. I told her that was the point. She just shook her head in exasperation at me. Bad name or not, I really hoped I didn't have to use it tonight. That always made things messy. But it was always good to have some insurance. I looked up at the moonless sky, wondering if she was doing all right. My partner, that is. When she had quit, she had been in a pretty bad way, and I had figured the best thing to do was let her be, so that she could figure things out. But that had been a long time ago. Too long. I wondered if I should call her after this, check up on her. Maybe. But that was for another time. I kept walking while thinking, my destination close in mind and at hand. It was darker than usual, with it being a new moon, but there were a couple of streetlights scattered around, and a few stars shone down from high above. One in particular seemed to shine much brighter than the rest, hanging in the sky directly in front of me, seeming to be directly where I was walking to. The North Star, I think. I don't know for sure. I'm no astronomer. Did it always shine this bright? I was so caught up in these thoughts that I almost didn't realize I had arrived at my destination. A small, squat building that lay at the end of the street, with the surprisingly bright star hovering directly over it. Big words on the windows confirmed that this was Better Tomorrows, and that I was in the right place. There was a smaller section of building off to the side where the women who were taking refuge there actually slept. But that wasn't what I was interested in. Rather, it was the office area, which made up the front of the building. I felt a little off-put by breaking into a place like this, where so many vulnerable innocents were staying, but I had to shake that off. I was doing this for a good cause, and besides, there was no reason that I should encounter any of the residents anyway. I wasn't going anywhere near where the woman slept. The office section was shut and the lights were off, making it clear that it was not currently open for business. I stared at the door for a moment, thinking about the best way to get in. I didn't want to stay out on the street for too long. A man standing in front of a woman's shelter in the middle of the night was a really bad look. I reached out and grabbed the door handle, only mildly surprised to find it unlocked. One would be surprised at how often people forget to lock up after work, but I would hope that a shelter would be doing a better job at security. I may need to send an anonymous letter about that later. But for now, I didn't look a gift horse in the mouth and slipped in, gently pulling the door shut behind me as I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket, shining it around the reception area. It cast a small circle of luminescence on chairs, tables, and a large desk, all of them empty and silent. The air felt oppressive around me, in that way that all places that you aren't supposed to be do. It was as if the room itself was glaring at you, telling you to leave, that you were not welcome here. But it wasn't as if I could just come in during the day and take a poke around. That would raise far too many questions that I didn't have answers to. And then it would turn into a big thing, and I didn't really want to deal with all of that. Not yet, anyway. Not before I had done some looking around myself first. So, I worked my way to a door at the back of the room, taking it slow and making sure not to shine my flashlight out the shuttered windows. I opened the door, the light causing dark shadows to stretch far away from me, giving everything a cave-like quality to it. Looking around, I saw that the room was composed of several small cubicles, each separated by low barriers between each one. Jackpot. Stepping through the door, I checked the outer walls of the small offices, relieved to see that they had small name cards on each one of their rough, off-white exteriors. There was only 6, but that would cut down the amount of rummaging I would have to do substantially. I worked my way down the hallway going left to right, with the third one being the winner. The words Ruth Levy were written on it in small brass letters, indicating that this was the place I was looking for. I entered the cramped space, surrounded by dark shapes that, during the day, would just be standard office equipment, but by night, in the dark, could be anything. I dared not turn on any sort of lights, though, for fear of drawing too much attention, so I had to make do. Her desk was clean, with only a few scattered papers about the financial state of the shelter, which after a quick once-over assured me that it seemed to be doing all right. As I looked around the desk, though, for a moment my gaze hovered on a small, framed photograph that rested in the corner of the desk. The picture inside showed a young boy, who I recognized as Seth, with an older woman with a similar face and hair, who I figured must be Ruth. She was holding him in her arms as they both smiled at the camera, blissfully unaware of the current situation that they were in. It disheartened me, in a way, the fact that this small happy family could be torn apart so easily. Things like this was why I had gotten into this line of work in the first place. But then the moment passed, and I tore my gaze away from the photo. I had limited time. I couldn't waste it staring at pictures, no matter how sweet they may be. That being said, I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for. Some sort of hint, a message from a disgruntled ex-lover or coworker. Maybe even something to suggest she was unhappy with her current state of affairs. But all I found were office supplies and clearly labeled files on the shelter and how it was being run. I pulled open the small filing cabinet, sifting through its contents. But it was all very self-explanatory work. That is, until, at the very back of the bottommost drawer, I found a small, unlabeled folder. It grabbed my attention. With everything else being so clearly marked, it was strange that this one was blank. I opened it, finding inside several papers and a handwritten note. I took that out and put it on the desk, reading it by the light of my flashlight. "Dear son," it read, the handwriting clear but a little scratchy, as though it had been written in haste. "If you are reading this, then I fear that something terrible has happened to me. I heard a noise. Muffled. Maybe not even there." I quickly swung my flashlight around the room, its beam illuminating empty cubicles and silent chairs. I scanned again, but there was still nothing. I was alone. But still, I felt unease in the pit of my stomach. I needed to hurry this up. Licking my lips, mouth suddenly dry, I went back to reading, trying to process it faster. "I want you to know that I love you, and no matter what, that will always be true. But I think that I might be working with some very bad people, and they might know that I know about them. I am going to be taking the evidence to the police tonight, but in the meantime, I am writing this note in case something happens between then and now. I pray that it doesn't. I'm going to ask my sister to deliver it to you, and if I don't come home soon, I want you to stay with her. Don't forget, There's ground beef in the fridge. You either need to have Auntie cook it for you or put it back in the freezer. Do not try to cook it yourself. Alright, I love you, honey. See you soon. Love, Mom. That was all that was written. Clearly, it had not been delivered as promised, and I had no illusions to think the reason as to why was innocuous. Something had caught up with her, but what? Was the shelter performing some sort of illegal activity? That was what the note seemed to be implying, if not outright stating. Perhaps tax fraud, or drug peddling, or even human trafficking. A grim thought, but if it was bad enough that they were willing to make anyone who was on their trail disappear, then they must really not want to be caught. I turned my attention to the one other note that was in the folder. That was actually several papers stapled together. There was a post-it note attached to the corner of said packet, which simply read, "Found on boss's desk." The paper was simply titled Project G, with no date, name, or location attached to it. Intrigued, I began to read. The project is proceeding accordingly. That being said, there are certain variables that we have not accounted for, such as the reaction that there has been to various animals/wildlife, as well as certain volatile individuals who have been able to interact with the project in ways we were not expecting. Despite this, we believe that if everything proceeds accordingly, we should have at least a 40% saturation by... A sudden noise made me quickly look up from the paper. That one was definitely real. I stuffed the contents of the folder back into it and stood up, holding it in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Running my flashlight around the room again, this time I caught movement as someone, or something, quickly ducked down behind one of the low walls, trying to avoid my light. Shit. This wasn't just some random office worker pulling a late night. This person was actively trying to avoid being seen. My hand crept toward the 7th shot, but I stopped myself. I was the intruder. I was the one who shouldn't be here. It may just be some terrified cleaning lady who thought I was a robber. Besides, there was an entire building of sleeping women who were already in a bad part of their lives right next door. I didn't want to scare them or, God forbid, actually hit one. Instead, I cleared my throat and called out. Hello? Who's there? I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just grabbing some papers for a friend. Only a partial lie, but it seemed to work, as I saw someone slowly coming up from behind the wall, but I only caught a quick glimpse of them before I felt something hit the back of my head. Hard.